Today I'll be talking about Israel, Palestine, and the U.S., and especially focusing on the U.S. connection, because I think that's the part that's told the least, that we need to know about the most, since most of us are living here and are American citizens. We receive a great deal of reporting on Israel-Palestine. So some aspects are reported frequently. For example, rockets from Gaza. Just about every single news report that mentions Palestine or Palestinians or Gaza, just about every time it tells that thousands of rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel. We hear that again and again. It's factual, we should know it, and we do know it. There was a headline about it in the New York Times a while ago with even an image that made it look very frightening. Given how often we hear about those thousands of rockets from Gaza, we've learned very little about them. For example, the fact is that in the large majority of cases, those are small, homemade projectiles. That somehow is left out of this report. We also get a statistic of sorts. We hear that thousands of rockets have been fired from Gaza. But they never tell us, well, about how many people have they killed in the over 10 years that they've been used. Thousands of rockets. Well, the last time I looked, the number was about 30 people. Fair-minded people, and I do believe that most Americans do wish to be fair-minded, would want to know, well, how many people in Gaza have been killed by Israeli forces during that same period that those thousands of rockets have been fired. And that number is also easily found. It's approximately 5,700 Gazans. But that's not in the news coverage that we receive every time. So what I found is that we get very filtered reporting. Some factual, important information we get again and again. Other factual and equally important information we almost never get. For example, we almost never learn from our news media that American taxpayers give Israel over $10 million per day of our money. Per day. And it's about to go up almost double. Not quite double, but it's about to go up again probably in about a year or two. This is more than we give to all of the starving countries in Africa put together. And yet that's almost never mentioned. We hear about Israeli children who have been killed. We often learn their names, see their parents. We grieve for those children as we should. However, we almost never hear about the Palestinian children killed during that same period. We almost never learn their names, we don't see their parents, and most Americans don't grieve for them just because they don't even know they've been killed. If you look at that first column, you'll notice that we'll go to the next one. By the way, the number one cause of those children's deaths, those 91 children, was gunfire to the head. It's my view that we should know about all of those children, that we should grieve for all of them. And if you look at that first column, the 91 Palestinian children, you'll notice that Palestinian children were killed first. The media consistently tell us that Israeli violence is retaliatory, that they're defending their population. The chronology is the reverse of that. I believe that if Americans had been told about that, if Americans had been told that our tax money was being used to shoot children in the head, that we would have demanded that it stop, no matter who did it. We would have demanded that our tax money not be used to shoot children in the head. And if we had done that, if the American population had done that, it's quite likely that it would have stopped. And then all those other children, both the Palestinian and the Israeli children, could be alive today if we had known about that and if we had done that. It's too late for all of those children, for all of those families. These are the numbers up through last year. But it's not too late for the ones coming. If we all demanded that our tax money not be used this way, then all of those other numbers that will come this year and have already come could be zero. if the media would tell Americans, and then if we would speak out. Many people ask how I became involved, because I don't happen to be Jewish or Arab or Muslim or Palestinian. My background is Christian. Like most Americans, I knew very little about this issue 14 years ago. I was the editor of a very small weekly newspaper in Northern California, writing about the city council and the local school district. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life, and so like most Americans in the library today, I just skimmed the headlines on this topic, accepted the confusion that I found, and moved on. We're very busy. We have a great deal to do. But then in fall of 2000, when what's called the Second Palestinian Uprising began, and it was in the news for a while, I decided to pay attention, to just learn about Israel-Palestine and to be up on the latest news and to learn what it was all about. And when I did that, as a journalist, I very quickly noticed that it was quite one-sided, that we would hear from and about Israelis in great detail, as I wanted to, but then I expected to also hear from and about Palestinians. Again, I wanted the full story, but I noticed that didn't come very often. That came much less frequently than the information from and about Israelis. So I began to look into it more and more, to go to the internet to see what I could discover there. And I found that there were excellent news sources from the region itself. The Israeli media, the Palestinian media, international humanitarian agencies that were there on the ground were sending out reports, daily reports about what was going on. And I discovered that Israeli forces were killing large numbers of largely unarmed demonstrators in large numbers every day. But then I read something even more disturbing in an Israeli newspaper about an Israeli report in which they had found that the strategy that the Israeli military was utilizing was not to kill too many, because if they killed too many, they were afraid the international community, maybe even Americans, would notice. So they weren't killing so many, apparently not too many, but they were injuring multitudes, because that would be off the radar. They injured over 6,000 men, women, and children in the first month alone of that uprising. And according to this Israeli report, they were specifically targeting 6,000 in 1 month, if I didn't say that. They were specifically targeting knees and eyes. So with that kind of information and my new awareness that it was our tax money that was funding this, I finally decided this might be the most covered up issue I had ever seen, and I decided that I needed to go and see for myself what was really going on. I decided to travel over there as a freelance reporter. Many years before, I had been in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. In that case, I had a very official organization helping and guiding me, the Peace Corps. In this case, I was going to be traveling completely alone. I had no organization sponsoring my trip or taking me around. So when I landed on in February 7th, 2001, I experienced a sudden pang of the disquiet I'd been trying to ignore on that long airline flight. What was it going to be like for me as a single female American to wander around through a largely Muslim land that was in the middle of a violent uprising, and that was at the epicenter, we're continually told, of people that are hostile to Americans in particular, and especially to women, we're always told. I wondered, what will it be like for me to wander alone? Well, as I traveled very randomly and haphazardly throughout Gaza and the West Bank, I found a very different situation that's being shown to Americans. I found that people were very welcoming. Whenever I said I was an American, which I always did, the invariable response was welcome. I was treated with respect. I was completely safe. But I also learned what was happening, what was being done to Palestinians already in early 2001. I found that they were largely living, in many cases, in small prisons within larger prisons. They often couldn't go to the next town over to go to work, to go to school, to go to the hospital, to deliver their baby. There were Israeli checkpoints in between. And by checkpoints, I don't mean toll booths. I mean soldiers in combat gear with machine guns. I remember growing used to, almost, arriving at a street corner in Gaza and seeing young soldiers with a machine gun aimed straight at you, sitting in a tank. You hoped they waved you on, rather than shooting you as they had some people. At night, you couldn't really see the soldiers very well in the dark, but you could see the flashlight with which they signaled whether or not you were allowed to continue driving, to continue living. That was just routine. That was in the good parts of town. The less desirable parts I saw were being shelled nightly. I went through residential neighborhoods full of destroyed homes. All of these pictures I'm showing you, by the way, I took myself. These are from early 2001. This is the Tufa area of Khan Yunis in Gaza. This is before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. This is several years before Hamas was elected. U.S. media consistently tell Americans that Israel is defending itself from Hamas and from rockets. Well, this is what it looked like before either of those were around. People came up to me, crowds of people came up to me, they smiled at me, they welcomed me to their Swiss cheese homes, children gathered around. At one point there was suddenly Israeli gunfire very nearby. We all ducked and moved away from that area to a safer place. As I wrote later, I originally thought that Israeli gunfire that suddenly erupted out of nowhere was just a coincidence. But as I thought about it more later, I think that was a very naive assessment. As I was going around that area, I could occasionally see Israeli guard towers overlooking us. And I have no doubt that those Israeli soldiers noticed that a foreigner was wandering around. And I suspect they finally decided to send her a message. Don't come here. Don't see what we're doing. But I did see, I saw beautiful agricultural lands next to the lovely blue Mediterranean Sea being destroyed. I saw what had been a 100-year-old stand of date palms completely flattened, olive groves and ancient olive groves destroyed. I talked to farmers who had farmed there forever. Their fathers had farmed that land, their grandfathers had farmed that land, their great-grandfathers had farmed that land, their great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers going back many generations had farmed that land. I wondered what they would do now. I wondered how a farmer feeds his family when all of his crops are destroyed, when all of his orchards are destroyed. I wondered how they would feed their children. I saw a land and a people being destroyed through the use of my tax money. To me, that's newsworthy. And I saw more. I don't like seeing suffering. I don't like seeing children in pain. But since thousands had already been injured through our tax money by that point, it was my job to see them. And all I had to do was go to the nearest hospital. I saw children with bullets in their backs, in their stomach, in their head. I saw one boy whose parents were happy to see me. I don't have his picture right now, but they were happy to see me because as an American, they thought maybe I could help their poor son. So I asked the doctor if maybe there was care that could be provided. Maybe there was something I could do. Maybe a surgical team could be flown in, or maybe their son could be flown to a hospital back in the United States. The doctor told me that he hadn't yet found the right time and the right way to tell the parents, but their son was totally and eternally paralyzed. And so I knew something they didn't know, and I wished that I didn't. And I remember in the West Bank going to a newspaper office, and they said a 9-year-old boy was just shot nearby. Maybe you'd like to go see, since I was a reporter. And thought, no, I wouldn't like to go see, but I did. I saw the living room and the wall hanging that said, I was told, thinking of God makes our hearts grow calm. It had a bullet hole in it. I saw the needle point over the front door that I could read myself that said, God bless our home. The family, I was told, had moved in 10 days before. This was sort of their dream home. And I saw the parents when they got back from their dead son from the hospital. I heard the mother and the sisters weeping and weeping. And I saw the father walking around shell-shocked. It looked to me like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that would never end. There were more funerals day after day. Another one was for a woman who had 3 sons, 18, 14, and 12. And I was interviewing people in the funeral. I found myself walking next to this woman who was the dead woman's neighbor. This woman had gone to college in the US, and she told me about her dead friend. She said that just a few days before, her friend had been asking her what it was like to go to college in the US, because her 18-year-old son wanted to go to college in the US. This woman explained to me, she said, it's every boy's dream in Palestine to go to college in the US. But she said, of course he won't go now, he'll stay home to help with his brothers. I saw more and more. On future trips, I saw a wall confiscating still more Palestinian land and imprisoning them still further. The Kafkaesque way that you get out of Bethlehem, if you're even allowed out of the prison that Bethlehem has become. And here's some pictures of my last trip to Gaza, places that had been full of people. So when I came back from that first trip, I began an organization, a journalistic type of organization called If Americans Knew. It wasn't if Christians knew, if Jews knew, if liberals knew, if conservatives knew. It was just if we all knew. And we focus, it's to get the facts to the general public in a nonpartisan, non-ideological way. We especially also focus on media coverage, because I feel strongly that in a democracy, in a republic, the most powerful institution are the news media. That's how we all learn what we think we know about many issues, especially international organizations and international issues. So we conducted media studies. My son is a scientist. I like the idea of a sort of scientific study that would be as immune to subjective bias as possible, in which we would choose a category that would be acknowledged as significant and that was quantifiable. Thanks so much. So we decided to look at how the media covered deaths among both populations. It's my view that all deaths are tragic and that both populations matter. We especially focused on the first year of the uprising because, as we know, first impressions are so powerful. They determine for us the context within which we ever after view a conflict or any situation. They determine for people who initiated the violence and who's defending their population. We also looked at a very significant and especially sad subcategory, the killing of children. I think we're all horrified when we hear that a child has been killed, regardless of the race, the religion, the ethnicity, or the nationality. I think we're deeply saddened when we hear of a dead child. Children are not supposed to be killed, but they are being killed, and it's especially newsworthy. So we decided to study that coverage. Using an Israeli source, we discovered that the number of children's deaths among Israelis were 28 Israeli children killed and 131 Palestinian children killed. How were these deaths covered by our primetime network news shows? Well, we discovered that they reported on Israeli children's deaths at rates up to 13 and 14 times greater than they reported on Palestinian children's deaths. Some of you may be wondering how the reporting could exceed 100% coverage. Well, we were counting every time there was a report on a child's death. So if there was a follow-up report showing parents burying their child, that would be counted for both populations. We knew, therefore, that it could exceed one report per child, we were astounded to see that it almost always does for Israeli deaths, in fact, sometimes by quite a bit. Whereas for Palestinian children's deaths, they never even come close to 100%. They're reported so minimally that many people don't even know that Palestinian children were killed first and in far greater numbers. In our study of the New York Times, our researcher thought it would be interesting to see what the data would look like if we graphed it chronologically for that first year. So the first curve that I'll show you will be the New York Times reporting on Israeli children's deaths that first 12 months. Next is the actual death curve of Israeli children killed that first year, which is a very similar curve, a little bit lower, but a very similar curve. Next, we'll see the New York Times reporting on Palestinian children killed that first year, which is this one, a very similar curve. A bit lower again, but they all three look quite similar. Next, I'll show you the actual death curve of Palestinian children killed by Israelis that first year, and here it is. All of these reports are up on our website in great detail. Many people will tell me that they do feel they're well informed on Israel-Palestine because they listen to NPR. Many pro-Israel groups have attacked NPR often, claiming that NPR is pro-Palestinian in its coverage. They've caused a lot of financial damage to some NPR affiliates around the country with that accusation. So a well-regarded media watchdog organization, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, decided to look into the NPR's coverage on this issue. Their researcher, Seth Ackerman, did an excellent job, and he discovered that NPR, yes indeed, NPR is very distorted on its reporting on this issue, but once again, in a pro-Israel direction. Nonviolence. The reason they say that is because the US media almost never report about this movement, and so most people have no idea that it's taking place. It's usually in small villages by villagers using nonviolence against the confiscation of their land, often farmers and their families are doing this. In a number of cases, they're also joined by people from around the world, of many backgrounds and ethnicities and ages. In a number of cases, some Israelis are coming and joining these nonviolent demonstrations. And yet we almost never hear about it, even though this is very courageous, because they are invariably met by extreme violence from Israeli military forces, some of it lethal. Many people have been injured, some permanently maimed, taking part in these. Some have been killed, mostly Palestinians, but some foreigners. Rachel Corrie was 23 years old. Crushed to death, Tom Herndl was 21 years old, shot in the head. Others, Brian Avery was shot in the face. Emily Hanashewitz is missing an eye. Tristan Anderson is now brain damaged and in a wheelchair. A young Swedish activist was badly beaten with a very grotesque chant and being said as she was being beaten. And yet this is almost never reported to the American public, although it is in the Israeli media quite often. Another omission of a very different sort occurred in 2003. This was not far away on the other side of the world. This was in the United States on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. It was an independent commission on the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty. On Capitol Hill, they reported publicly their findings. The chairman was a retired 4-star admiral who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You cannot get much higher than that. With him was a retired rear admiral who had been in charge of the whole legal department of the U.S. Navy. Also part of that commission was a Marine general. And not just any Marine general. This was the highest-ranking Congressional Medal of Honor recipient in the United States. They reported that Israeli forces had attacked and tried to sink a U.S. Navy ship, that they had killed 34 Americans, injured over 170 of them. They reported that rescue flights to these men had been recalled by order of the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States. They also announced that this had been ordered to be covered up by the President of the United States, and they announced in this public briefing on Capitol Hill that this had constituted an act of war by Israel against the United States of America. And yet, well, none of this was covered. The Washington Post missed it, the New York Times missed it, the allegedly patriotic network Fox News had nothing about that. If you'd like to read about it, it was reported in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, the military newspaper abroad, and it is in detail in the congressional record, where you can read every word that they said in their report. Now let's look at some of the recent Israel-Gaza wars. We'll look at two of the fairly recent ones and how they were covered and some of the facts. So in the one that took place in 2008 to 9, right over Christmas vacation and New Year's, these are the numbers killed by the other side among both populations. Now, I'm sure as you're aware, the media call this, a war. The Israel-Gaza war is how they often term these things. As I'm sure you're aware, that's not what a war looks like. That's what a massacre looks like. Then let's look at the one summer before last in 2014. Again, when there was, quote, a Gaza-Israel war. The media begin the sequence of events that led to that onslaught in summer of 2014 with the abduction and tragic murder of 3 young Israelis that took place on June 12th. That's where they begin the sequence of events, the loss of life, the abduction, and loss of life of Israelis. Well, let's look at both populations. Let's care about everybody and start from January 2014 to see what preceded that onslaught. And we'll look at January to see deaths among both populations, and we see that Palestinians were killed in January, including a child. But apparently that doesn't count and isn't mentioned. Then we look at February. And we see again, Palestinians were killed, but apparently that's not newsworthy. Then we see March, and still more Palestinians are killed, including a child. But again, apparently that's not newsworthy or relevant to mention. April, we see an Israeli soldier and another Palestinian has been killed. And then in May, we see still more Palestinians killed, including 2 children. But apparently none of that is relevant to mention. None of it is considered newsworthy. Then we get to June, where we see the 3 Israelis. And then we have news coverage. And then we look at the next month of July, and those are the numbers. Now, as I mentioned, they start the sequence of events with the 3 Israelis who were abducted. This was major news. There were news reports about it every day. We learned their names. We learned about, they were being searched for. This was very, very well covered in the U.S. media. Well, again, let's care about both populations, and I wonder if any Palestinians perhaps also were forcibly abducted by Israelis. Let's look at the numbers, and we discovered that over 2,000 Palestinians were forcibly abducted. But again, it's only the 3 Israelis that we learn about. And then after that war, as the media called it, over 100,000 people were homeless. Thousands had been injured in an area where almost all of the hospitals were either destroyed or damaged, and in a location where, because of the Israeli blockade on Gaza that began since about 2005 or so, they were already undersupplied with major, just standard medications were already undersupplied. The kinds of things you need in an operating room were often missing. And yet none of this is mentioned. If there's an earthquake or a tsunami or tornado or flooding, we afterwards see the people trying to put back their lives, and we see the suffering and the difficulties. Our hearts go out to them. We often send charity and help. In this case, none of this apparently was did they bother to tell Americans about. Many people ask me, well, when I began to look into this back 14 years ago, I began to wonder, well, how did this all really start? What is the origin? What is the Israel-Palestine all about? And when I did that, I quickly learned that when I was born, there was no Israel, there was Palestine. When I was born, it was under the British Empire. Before that, it had been under the Ottoman Empire for several centuries, before that, other empires. So if there was no Israel when I was born, then where did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict come from? Some people are led to believe that, well, they've just been fighting each other for thousands of years. You know, I hear people say that. But actually, if you look at the history of the region, this is easy to look at, you discover that in the late 1800s, Palestine was at peace. It had a somewhat multicultural population in that it was about 80% Christian, about 80% Muslim, about 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, and a little under 5% Jewish, all living together harmoniously, side by side, as they'd done for centuries, their ancient churches and ancient synagogues, etc. So how did the violence begin? What started the violence? Well, it turns out it did not originate in Palestine. It originated in Europe and very quickly in the United States with a political movement, not a religious one, a political movement and an ideology known as political Zionism. There was a movement to create a Jewish state in Palestine that began in the late 1800s. As I said, many of us have heard the slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land, despite the fact that that it was already, of course, a populated location. It was the crossroads of civilization, an ancient land, fully inhabited, 95% of whom were not Jewish. So this would be a movement to dispossess and push out 95% of the inhabitants. My book and my talk focuses on the U.S. aspect. What surprised me as I started reading books and researching this 14 years ago was how early this movement became active in the United States. We've all heard of socialism, fascism, capitalism. We could loosely define those terms. And yet most of us, I'm fairly certain, have not heard of Zionism or Zionist, until perhaps fairly recently, and could not even define them. I was recently at a high school reunion and tried that out with some well-educated classmates and asked them, do you know what Zionism is or Zionist? And they said what I think I would have said 14 years ago. They'd sort of look and say, Zionism, I think I've heard that term. None of them knew what it was. Most of them, didn't even say that much. And yet this is an ideology and a movement that has profoundly affected our own country negatively, has tragically impacted the Middle East, dangerously as we see today, impacted the whole world, and yet most of us have never even heard of it or know what it is. By 1910, there were 20,000 Zionists in the United States. By 1920, it was about 200,000 Zionists, and it was already becoming a movement to which congressmen listened, especially in the larger cities in 1910. By the way, this was a small percentage of the Jewish population, most of whom were not Zionists for many decades, were not Zionists, some of whom actually actively opposed Zionism. But it was a significant political movement. In 1914, there was especially an important development when a prominent Boston attorney named Louis Brandeis became the head of World Zionism. It moved to Boston. I had not even known before there was such a thing as World Zionism, let alone that it was headquartered in my country. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson named Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court, where he was an especially well-respected Supreme Court justice. I think that probably very few of us could name many Supreme Court justices for the past century. But this is one of the ones that many of us could name, Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, etc. Well, it turns out that when you're a Supreme Court justice, the normal ethical practice is to resign your affiliations, your board memberships, etc. So he officially resigned as head of World Zionism, but he continued to lead it from his Supreme Court chambers. This is documented in a number of books. His loyal lieutenants would come into his Supreme Court chambers, report on what they were doing. He would give them directives to then go and carry out. This was, of course, highly improper, which is why he kept it secret. It's also, as you know, sometimes things are more effective if you do them secretly. Now, this next information, I'll give you the citation. If you do get my book, you'll see that my book is literally half citations. So everything that I'm telling you, you can look and see where the source of my information is. What I did was, 14 years ago, I began to read books on this issue. I was looking for reliable, factual books. I would look at the footnote to see where the information came from. I would then often order those books, look at those footnotes, order those books, and on and on. One of the books that I read was called Israel in the Mind of America, published by a very mainstream publisher. The author is a very establishment mainstream author, respected author, Peter Gross. He was at the New York Times. He was then at Harvard for a while. He's written several other nonfiction books. He tilts towards Israel. He is definitely, a fan of Israel. Well, in his book, he had about 2 pages, I think, a little bit of information, in which he said that Louis Brandeis had been a leader in a secret Zionist society that had operated in the United States. This was not while he was a fraternity boy or something. This was while he was a sitting Supreme Court justice. I was shocked at that statement. So, of course, I looked at the footnote to see what his sources were, and discovered the main source was from a scholarly journal, the American Jewish Historical Quarterly, an article that was published in 1975. So then I looked into, well, who was the author of that article? Was this perhaps some anti-Semite that had somehow gotten an article in the American Jewish Historical Quarterly? And I found that no, this was an Israeli author, Dr. Sarah Schmidt, who is at a mainstream Israeli university. This is her field of expertise, Zionism and American Zionism. So she had written that article. They report that this was an elitist secret society from the Hebrew word that meant Pharisees and separate. The members of the parashim would spread out across the United States and would sort of plant these ideas around the U.S., especially at high levels. There was even an initiation ceremony in which when someone became a member of this society, they would swear that they would place the objectives of Zionism above family, above school, above nation. And the Supreme Court Justice was a member, in fact, probably 2 Supreme Court Justices. As early as 1915, a parashim leader suggested that the British might gain benefit from a formal declaration in support of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine in 1915. Some of you who have heard of the Balfour Declaration may be connecting this. I'll get to that. But many of you might be wondering, as I would have, what would the British get from this? Huge as the British Empire was, in 1915 it did not include Palestine. That was under the Ottoman Empire. So what was this all about? Well, let's remember what was going on at that time. It's what they called then the Great War, World War I. Massive carnage. The British and the German side, which the German side included the Ottoman Empire, so both the British and the German were desperate to get the US on their side, especially Britain was losing the war at one point. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British casualty number was 60,000 men in one day of battle. So they desperately wanted the U.S. to come in on their side of the war. But the American public was that thing that we're often told is a negative thing. The American public was, quote, isolationist. They didn't want to go join a foreign war, a pointless war, that had nothing to do with them, to kill and be killed. So Woodrow Wilson was elected to his second term of office with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Well, some British Zionists saw this as an opportunity, the British desperation. One of them in particular named Chaim Weizmann, who later became the president of Israel, went to the British government. And he claimed that the Zionists could help Britain get the U.S. into the war and help them win the war through their colleagues, through their Zionist colleagues in the United States. And they specifically mentioned Louis Brandeis, who was close to President Wilson. They claimed that through these contacts, they could influence the U.S. to enter World War I on the side, well, the Great War, on the side of Britain. If Britain would promise them that if they did that, it would help to facilitate their Zionist project to create a Jewish state in Palestine. This is mentioned in many books. It was called the Gentleman's Agreement, in which there was this quid pro quo. And through that, they obtained a declaration from England called the Balfour Declaration, in which basically it was said that England would sort of favor and help this Zionist project. It's a fairly mild declaration, but it opened the door, it cracked open the door that Zionists could open still further. By the way, the Balfour Declaration was supposedly a letter from Lord Balfour, the Foreign Minister of England, to Lord Rothschild, who was one of the heads of British Zionism. But it actually was not written by Lord Balfour. The real author was a secret Zionist. His name is in my book. And the text for the Balfour Declaration went back and forth between Britain and the United States before they finalized what the text would be. After the war, when the Ottoman Empire had been defeated and the victors were dividing the spoils, the Balfour language was put into the mandate and Britain was put in charge of Palestine. It then did what the Zionists wanted, which was allow massive Jewish immigration and colonization of Palestine with the intention of creating a Jewish state. Very sadly, but not surprisingly, that led to violent conflict. Innocent lives on both sides then as now were lost. Then as now the large majority of those innocent lives were the Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Some Zionist terrorist groups were created, the Irgun and the Stern Gang. The leaders of those two terror groups later became prime ministers of Israel. The leader of the Irgun, Menachem Begin, in an interview with a British journalist, bragged that Zionists had introduced terrorism to the Middle East. In fact, he bragged that they had introduced their terrorism to the world. Again, going back to the U.S. connection, it turns out that there were front groups in the United States connected to these two terror gangs that were at times funneling them money and weaponry. The Irgun agent was named Hillel Cook. He came to the United States and adopted the alias of Peter Bergson. Another man was named Baruch Korf. He was particularly connected to the Stern Gang. Now, the British, as the violence increased between the two populations, and there was often a great deal of violence at the British themselves, so the British periodically would try to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine, because that's what was creating all of this violence. So they'd say, okay, we're going to limit the immigration, the colonization, and then the Zionists would hate the British and kill the British. So in 1947, the British were limiting the immigration, the colonization, and the Stern Gang, a portion of the Stern Gang that was in Paris, was led by an American rabbi named Baruch Korf. Korf decided that they would get an airplane and fly it over London and drop bombs on the foreign ministry to prove that they couldn't get away with doing what they were doing. They had the money, they had the gang, they had the plane, but they were missing one thing: they didn't know how to fly the plane. So they recruited a young American aviator named Reginald Gilbert, who had been an ace in World War II. Gilbert pretended to go along with the plot, but then he secretly went to the American embassy. They informed the Paris police and Scotland Yard and eventually foiled the plot, and it did not go forward. Korff had very powerful friends in the United States, so he eventually got off without any real consequences. I was curious about what happened to him in later life. I'd never heard about this. This particular incident is only in my book. No other book that I've ever seen happens to have it. And I discovered that in later life, Korff became quite close to President Richard Nixon. And Nixon even sort of fondly would refer to Korff as his rabbi. Now, all of this, of course, is the precursor to today's very powerful lobbying group, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. AIPAC, according to Fortune magazine, is one of the two most powerful lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C., lobbying Congress for policies. And AIPAC is just one of many entities within the Israel lobby. The direct precursor to AIPAC came in about 1939 with the creation of the American Zionist Emergency Council, AZEC. By 1943, AZEC had a budget of $500,000 at a time when a nickel bought a loaf of bread. Before too long, they had access to an even far larger fund in which they had access to the kind of money that in today's dollars was the equivalent of about $1 billion, with which to propagandize every sector of American society. They used that massive amount of money very effectively. They targeted congressmen, Christian clergy, editors, professors, both business and labor, Jewish war veterans. Every population was targeted with this propaganda. And they created hundreds of local committees around the United States. They funded books, made them huge bestsellers, buried other books that actually were factual. They especially worked to manufacture Christian support, since the majority of Americans were Christians. So they specifically had a memo that to crystallize the sympathy of Christian America for our cause. They funneled money into two supposedly Christian groups that would go along with that. During all of this time, there was considerable opposition to Zionism from diverse sectors of the U.S. Two of the most distinguished Christian clergy opposed Zionism for religious and moral reasons. American Christian clergy in the Middle East, some of them specifically went to the Paris peace talks to advocate for self-determination of the Arab peoples, of Palestinians, because that's what Woodrow Wilson was enunciating, self-determination of peoples. So they went there to try to advocate for that for Palestinians and Arabs in the Middle East. A very distinguished Dead Sea scholar named Miller Burroughs wrote an excellent book called Palestine is Our Business, in which he discussed the moral responsibility Americans had to speak out and to support Palestinian human rights. A Jewish author wrote excellent books, Alfred Lilienthal. Another one was Rabbi Elmer Berger. They were leaders of the American Council for Judaism that was specifically opposing Zionism. The governmental establishment also opposed Zionism, specifically because it would be detrimental to U.S. strategic interests and would harm the United States. They wrote memo after memo, report after report, describing how damaging Zionism would be for the United States. In some, they even pointed out that it was antithetical to the principles that Americans believe. This began early on. There was a commission, Woodrow Wilson sent a commission to Palestine in 1919 to study the feasibility of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. The commission came back with a very powerful report saying that that would be a grave trespass on the rights of the people, that Zionism should be abandoned. But their report was buried and nothing came of it. Numerous members of the State Department, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies said that it would endanger Americans to support Zionism. The Secretary of Defense was outraged that a domestic lobby was pushing through policies that would hurt Americans. Dean Acheson, the CIA, the head of Near Eastern, the Department of the Near East and the State Department, all said that supporting Zionism would imperil American interests. I have a lot of quotes. I won't go through all of them now. They're in my book by various people in the State Department, predicting that Zionism would be very damaging to the United States. But Harry Truman did what basically both parties, presidents and politicians from both parties, have done ever since. He put his desire to get elected above national interests and above moral policies. He said to his State Department, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents." Now, in 1947, Britain, with all of the violence that was going on, finally decided to turn the question of Palestine over to the United Nations to solve. The United Nations at that time could have affirmed the charter principle on which the UN was founded, the bedrock principle of democracy. There could have been elections, free and open elections, in which the people that lived in Palestine would form their own government and their own country. But instead of doing that, the General Assembly, under extreme pressure from Zionists, both bribes and threats, General Assembly members voted through what's called the partition. But there was an American journalist who tried to tell Americans about what had happened. She was, according to the Britannica Encyclopedia, this was one of the most famous journalists of the 20th century. In fact, I believe in another place that Britannica calls Dorothy Thompson the most important female journalist of the 20th century. And yet I had never even heard of her. Well, she had a radio program that was listened to by millions of Americans, a newspaper column published all across the United States. She was such a celebrity that there was a Broadway play loosely patterned on her life in which she was played by Lauren Bacall, and a Hollywood movie in which she was played by Katharine Hepburn. She was an amazing journalist. In the 1930s, she had been a foreign correspondent in Germany. She had been one of the first journalists to warn about the rise of the Nazis. She was, in fact, the first foreign correspondent to be ejected by Hitler. Because of that, she was very sympathetic to Zionism. So after the war and after the new Jewish state was created, she went over to see this wonderful new Israel, and she discovered hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees living under extremely harsh conditions, many dying every day. And she began to tell Americans about them, to speak about them, to write about them, to tell about their plight, to tell that Israel was not allowing them to return to their homes. And for telling Americans about these people, she lost her newspaper column, she lost her radio program, and as her biographer put it, for doing this, she was erased from history. And now today, if I tried to write about some of the topics that I've discovered for my book for a popular history magazine, which would be the normal course for an author to do, my article would not get published. How do I know that? Is this just paranoid speculation? No. A few years ago, our organization tried to publish a paid advertisement in American History magazine for another book, not about mine, a book by a 91-year-old former Republican congressman. But we were told told by the owner of American History magazine that because our organization, he said, was anti-Israel, they would not publish our paid advertising in American History magazine or in any of the history magazines that he owns, which is virtually every history magazine in the United States. It is very important to be aware that Israel-Palestine is the core issue of the Middle East. When you go to the Middle East, that becomes very clear. This is the core issue of the Middle East. Almost everything that happens there is related to Israel-Palestine, or certainly everything very significant is most often related to Israel-Palestine. We invaded Iraq because this was pushed by Israel partisans in the Bush administration. This has been written about in several excellent books that document it in detail and was written about quite openly in the Israeli media, in which they talked about Israel partisans who pushed the U.S. to enter the war. Now, by destroying Iraq, by the things that went on in Iraq, I'm sure we won't forget Abu Ghraib, for example, then we destabilized the Middle East, and now we have Syria. And now with the tragic violence and extremism that has engendered, we have refugees from Syria flooding into Europe. Some of them not making it. Then we have Iran. Israel had some analysts on behalf of Israel had early on said we have three countries we need to neutralize. This was quite openly done in a number of publications. They said Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So now Iraq has been destroyed, Syria is in turmoil, but Iran was left. So we've enacted, for a while, crippling sanctions on Iran that really would be is tantamount to an act of war when you put a country under a blockade. And the people who have pushed us to do that, tried to push for even more, but so far have failed, are the same groups that pushed for us to invade Iraq. This was a newspaper ad, a full-page ad put in the New York Times a while ago, making Ahmadinejad look so dangerous, and etc. These are the names at the bottom I put on the list so you could actually read them. That's who's pushing Iran. Now, the reason I wrote my book about history is, as George Orwell once wrote, he who controls the past controls the future. It's essential that we learn all of these facts and that we learn the past if we are to change the future that we're now heading toward, which, as we're seeing today, is a very dark one. But we have the power to change that. So thank you for coming today.